It wasn't until the last decade when most people in the West began to realize there was a turmoil bubbling over into the world at large that had its political and religious roots in the ancient past. This building being destroyed was for many generations considered to be the final resting place of Joseph in the ancient city of Shechem, modern-day Nablus. The violent nature of this controversy is one reason why many archaeologists have stayed away from biblical archaeology or religious sites.
When one works in the time periods that the Old Testament reflects, that is a period from approximately 1500 BCE to approximately 200 AD, let's say, so that's 1700 years. In the Near East, that includes Egypt in this particular statement I'm about to make, political elements today, that is the modern states of Egypt and Palestine and Israel and Iraq and Iran, etc., are not interested in dealing with the topic that we're discussing today. That is the Bible, in effect, is the Bible correct or not? Does the Bible reflect something that really happened or not? If you're talking about the Exodus, did the Exodus happen or not? The only group of people that I know of that are actively involved, of course, in looking at this topic are the Israelis. And the Israelis are interested in it just as the Egyptians are not interested in it, or Syrians are not interested in it, for a political reason. I mean, I'm not only saying a political reason. There's clearly scholarly interest, etc., but Israelis are interested in showing that they, Israelis, represent or are the descendants of people that were there from 1200 BC on. Whereas, as you know, in terms of the political elements occurring today, the warfare we have in the Near East, that no Arab or Muslim state is going to pursue that topic, saying that the Jews were there at 1200 BC. They don't want that to be the case. They may not believe that it was the case. So they're not going to pursue the topic.
While in Israel, I talked with Israeli archaeologists on both sides of the biblical debate. I found the reason why some archaeologists are skeptical, besides the controversy issue, has to do with the dates assigned to the Exodus and the conquest. The lack of evidence at the time of Ramesses in the 13th century BC has discredited the pursuit of biblical archaeology in their view. However, as shown in the film, there is strong chronological evidence that points to the Exodus long before the time of Ramesses. Israeli archaeologists like Norma Franklin, Zeev Herzog, and Israel Finkelstein are of the mainstream position that if there was any evidence for an exodus and conquest, it would have happened in the 13th century BC, around the 1250 to 1200 BC time period. I now have become convinced this date is incorrect. I'm giving you this context to help you understand the mindset seen in these next interviews and to tell you why, in my opinion, they have lost confidence in the Bible's narrative and biblical archaeology. It comes down mainly to the dating issue.
I'm an archaeologist. I deal with the biblical period, so although we don't like to call ourselves biblical archaeologists, that's what I am. In the main, I deal with the 10th, 9th, and 8th century BC. And my real home, as far as archaeology is concerned, is Megiddo, Tel Megiddo, a biblical Armageddon. I've been excavating there together with Tel Aviv University and Israel Finkelstein since 1992.
Now, if we talk about what is the hill country telling you about Joshua and the story of Jericho and these cities being burned, well, what is the archaeology telling you?
Well, in the old days, of course, most archaeologists took the Bible and they read the Bible as a archaeological guide to the Holy Land. We don't do that now. Everything that we know now is based on excavations, on surveys, on data. And now we say, yes, there are destructions, but they don't happen within the lifespan of one person. They don't even happen in the lifespan of two generations. So we're not looking at an event, Joshua coming in with the children of Israel and destroying cities in order to take them over. That we don't see. We see something else which is happening, but we don't know We can't say that this is linked to the Exodus because we don't see the Exodus. What we do see is the settling down in villages, smaller settlements of people who are living differently to how people lived in the land 100 to 200 years earlier. But this is something which doesn't have to be attributed to some migration that we only know about from the biblical text and not from fact. So the whole time we have to go between what we know about from the biblical narrative and what we actually find on the ground.
Norma Franklin was describing the situation around the time of Ramesses. But if the Israelites came into the land much earlier than that time, actually came hundreds of years earlier in the Middle Bronze Age, would this be an explanation as to why some Israeli archaeologists can't find the evidence? Was there an Exodus?
I don't believe there was a single event that we can call the Exodus, archaeologically or historically.
Israeli archaeologist Zeev Herzog was one of the first voices in his field to openly discount the early events recorded in the Bible. In 1999, Israel's oldest newspaper, Haaretz, featured a cover-page article by Herzog titled "Deconstructing the Walls of Jericho." It touched off a firestorm of controversy. In this article, Herzog wrote that the Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. Is the Exodus a real event, or what do you see in the archaeology?
Let me answer it a little bit more divided. I believe that, in my own experience, there were two phases. And as a student, as a young scholar, we considered the biblical stories as historical events, and we tried to, as the founders of biblical archaeology science, we made the best to find the reality, the material evidence to exhibit and to illustrate the biblical history. This was, I would say, until the 80s of the 20th century, when accumulation of data in many aspects of the archaeology led us to what I call a revolution in scientific revolution, to realize that what we did until then was to find excuses to explain why the material data does not fit to the biblical stories. And once we realized this point, we said, well, stop, we have to see what archaeology tells us if we did not have the Bible, biblical history, just as we interpreted periods in other lands or in other periods which earlier, let's say, Chalcolithic period. We have no Bible for this period. And we interpret the history and the society which we uncover in the archaeological material. Once we came to this realization, we concluded that the history which we find in the archaeological record is entirely different from what is described in the Bible. And it is not just the case of the Exodus, it's a whole sequence of events from the patriarchal age. Let's say from this flood story. But on the flood, most people would agree that this was a legendary and not a real historical event. And so then we moved forward in this concept, and we say, okay, the patriarchal age is also not really historical, and we cannot find the exact period of time as we tried before when the patriarchs lived. And we went on with these questions and skepticism toward the Exodus and the conquest and even the so-called United Monarchy. Actually, until the 8th century BC, or let's say 9th century BC, when we have both archaeological evidence and outside sources, Assyrian documentation and other inscriptions which indicate the historicity of the biblical stories, all this pre-9th century BC should be considered as a legendary phase which has some kernels of history in different periods in different places, which in some time were compiled and were collected together and were described in a synchronic system of history as the writers and the compilers of the Bible believed in them. So, and this is my point. The Exodus story is a legendary compilation about the people of Israel, but it has no real historical basis.
The lack of evidence for the Exodus and conquest in the 13th century has caused Israel Finkelstein to create a theory. He agrees with Herzog that the early books of the Bible were not written by Moses at the time of the event of the Exodus, but were compiled hundreds of years later from a collection of stories, memories, and myths as a means to create a history for both religious and political purposes. Is there a time when Jericho was destroyed where walls fell down or it was burned? Or
I don't think so. I don't think that we have evidence, this kind of evidence in the case of Jericho, and I don't think that we can really look for this evidence. We are very much past this phase of archaeological research, and in my opinion, what we need to do is understand the this archaeology background, and then turn again to the text. You remember, we are historians practicing archaeology, so we need to turn to the text, back to the text, to the biblical text, and try to understand it on the background of the time of the authors. What I'm saying about Exodus is that when we try to read Exodus on the background of the 13th century BC, it simply doesn't work because there is no archaeological evidence, and I'm not sure that there is extra-biblical historical evidence. So my solution to this would be that since as I told you before, I think that there was this tradition of Exodus relatively very early in the Hebrew mind, if you wish to call it that way. So then you need to say that yes, there was some sort of a memory of events that had taken place many centuries before, maybe in the second millennium, in the middle of the second millennium, the expulsion, quote unquote, of Asiatics from the Delta, sometimes in the 16th century BC, but that this early memory was put into the story in order, first of all, on the background of many centuries later in the time of the authors, and also in order to convey their ideology. Because I don't think that people sit down one morning and say, well, let's write the history of the Exodus. You see, when they compile a story like this, they have something to tell you. I mean, there's a message there, this or that way. I mean, each of us can read the message in a different way, but we must try to understand what they are trying to tell us, because we are not dealing with a period of, a clerk sitting somewhere and you're just recording what exactly had happened, It's more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. The question is that why would they invent such a history of being slaves?
Well, I don't think that they invent history, first of all. And the word invent cannot be used, in my opinion, regarding the Hebrew Bible. Because I don't think that, in antiquity, people invented stories. There were enough stories around them to pick up and, use them in order to convey what they wanted to tell the people, okay?
So what you're saying is that you think that there is truth to that part of the story, that it was part of the truth?
Truth is also not a word that can be used.
Okay.
Neither truth nor invent. We are dealing with traditions. That is to say, let's say that the author of this or that part of the Hebrew Bible sits in Jerusalem, let's say, in the 7th century or in the 5th century BC, and people live around him, and the temple is only 200 meters from him or her. And if it's in the 7th century, the palace of the Davidic kings is also not far. And people have traditions. Grandpa says this, and grandma says another story. And there is one tradition of this village, another tradition of that family, and that clan, and this tribe, and so on and so forth. Then they have traditions that came to Judah from Israel by, in my opinion, refugees who came to Judah after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. And these are also important traditions, and they have to deal with them, though many of them are antagonistic to Judah and the Davidic kings because they come from the north, okay? So they collect all these traditions, stories, myth, theological stories, and so on, and then they sort them out. Because it would be naive to think that everything that had been collected was immediately put in writing. I mean, they looked at the stories probably, and they said, well, this fits us and this does not, okay? So they collected all these traditions, and then they decided which traditions go into the text. We will never know, whether the text as we read it today is what? 20% of the traditions of the Hebrew kingdoms, 10%, 5%, or 95%. This we'll never know. There's no way to know. But they definitely collected those stories which they could put to work in order to convey what they wanted to tell the people of Israel in their own time.
You said that two things that I remember. One was that you said that working in archaeology has actually made you appreciate the biblical story more.
I would say the following, I'm coming from first of all, I have not only appreciation, I have great respect to the text. I love reading the Bible and dealing with the Bible, and I have great admiration for the authors of the biblical text. I see the authors as incredible genius. It's an incredible genius work. What you see and what you read today. I can say that, and this respect was in me always, but has always been with me. But I think that the more I study the history of ancient Israel, the more I study the relationship between archaeology and the text, I become closer to the text and to the authors in a way that I think that I managed to penetrate a little bit into their world and maybe understand a little bit their concerns. And once you understand these people, if I'm not wrong, of course, then of course your respect to these people is bigger and you feel maybe closer to them in a way.
I think that Israel Finkelstein has tried to find answers, and so have I. After this first interview, he invited me to come the following year and help him at his dig site so we could continue our discussion about the Bible and archaeology. My son was getting married at the time, so I had to pass, but I hope I still have a rain check.